The wind was a raw, unforgiving hand, scouring the last vestiges of warmth from the land, tearing at Alara's threadbare shawl. Dust, finer than flour, coated her tongue, gritty against her teeth. For 2 days, she had seen nothing but the endless, unforgiving expanse of the sagebrush flats, the distant, skeletal peaks of mountains that offered no solace, only the promise of deeper cold. Her boots, worn to paper-thin soles, offered little protection against the frozen earth, each step a dull ache radiating up her shins. Hunger gnawed at her, a persistent, physical void that overshadowed even the grief that had hollowed her out weeks ago. John, her husband, had succumbed to the fever in a forgotten dust-trapped town, leaving her with a wagon, a dwindling purse, and a map that led nowhere she wanted to be. The wagon she traded for a horse, the horse for passage with a freighter. Then the freighter had vanished in the night, leaving her abandoned, again on the edge of this desolate plain. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, snaked down her spine. The sun, a pale, indifferent disk, dipped lower, bleeding weak color across the bruised horizon. She needed shelter, a sliver of warmth, anything to ward off the certain death the night promised. Her eyes, red-rimmed and perpetually scanning, caught a flicker, a smudge against the darkening landscape. It wasn't the ghost of a homestead, nor the mirage of water she so often chased. It was a man, slumped against a boulder, half hidden by a twisted juniper. Fear, sharp and immediate, cut through the numb despair. Solitude had been her only companion, her only shield against a world that had proven itself cruel. Another human meant another threat, another loss waiting to happen. She debated circling wide, a desperate, energy-sapping detour, but her legs were leaden, her mind clouded by exhaustion. As she drew nearer, cautiously, silently, she saw he wasn't merely resting. He was still, too still. A dark stain bloomed on the front of his rough-spun shirt, spreading slowly, steadily. Her breath hitched, a gunshot wound. He looked like a man forged from the very rock he leaned against, broad-shouldered, weathered with a dark, untamed beard that obscured much of his face. His clothes were practical, worn, like a man who spent his life under an open sky. Not a settler, not a town dweller, an outsider. He stirred, a low groan escaping him, and his head lolled, revealing eyes that were surprisingly light, piercing even in their pain. They fixed on her, no surprise, no anger, just a weary, assessing gaze. He made no move to draw a weapon, though a rifle lay carelessly beside him, almost within reach. Alara hesitated, her instincts screaming retreat, but something held her. Perhaps it was the shared vulnerability of the injured, perhaps the sheer desperation that chipped away at her ingrained caution. He was dying. She knew the look. She had seen it on John's face. She knelt a few feet away, her voice a raspy whisper. "You're hurt," he grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. His gaze drifted to her empty hands, her gaunt face. He didn't ask her name nor offer his. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions, with the vastness of the empty world around them. The chill deepened. Night was falling fast. If she left him, he would be dead by morning. If she stayed, what then? She had nothing to offer, no medicine, barely the strength to carry herself. Yet, something in his quiet, suffering dignity arrested her. He wasn't pleading. He was simply enduring. And in that, there was a strange, silent kinship. The decision, when it came, was not born of charity but of a raw, desperate logic. To leave him was to acknowledge her own powerlessness, to surrender to the apathy of the land. To stay, however futile, was to cling to a sliver of agency, to fight against the crushing weight of utter solitude. She unwrapped the meager remnants of her shawl, tearing a strip of the coarse wool. It was useless for warmth, but it might stem the flow. His eyes followed her movements, still unreadable, but a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, passed through them. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice steadier than she felt. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the rough fabric, pressing it against the dark wound. The material quickly saturated, a dark bloom spreading outward. It was deep. She knew it. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but didn't pull away. The silence continued, punctuated only by the wind's mournful howl and his ragged breathing. She watched his face, taut with pain, and saw the grim set of his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand where it rested on the ground. He was strong, but even strength had its limits against a bullet. He shifted, slowly, painfully, his gaze sweeping the desolate terrain around them. "They'll be back," he rasped, his voice a gravelly rumble. His first words, and they were a warning. "Who?" she asked, a knot tightening in her stomach. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed a finger, slow and deliberate, to a narrow cleft in the rock face, barely a fissure, perhaps 50 yards distant. "Over there. Shelter." It wasn't a question, but an order, or perhaps a statement of grim necessity. Her mind raced. The idea of moving him, of getting him there, seemed impossible. Yet the alternative was worse. He pushed himself up, grunting, leaning heavily on the boulder. She understood. He would try whether she helped or not. She moved to his side, offering her shoulder, slender and unsuited for his bulk. But it was all she had. He leaned on her, a surprising weight that threatened to buckle her knees, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward. Each step was agony for him, a slow, arduous shuffle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fissure was less a cave, more a shallow overhang, but it offered protection from the direct assault of the wind. Inside, the temperature was a few degrees less punishing. He collapsed, his back against the cold stone, eyes closed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. She rummaged through his saddlebags, which he had indicated with a nod. Inside, a small haversack with dried meat, a half-empty canteen, and a flint. A fire. The word felt like a prayer. She gathered what little dry brush and twigs she could find in the fading light, her fingers clumsy. He watched her, his eyes slits, then slowly reached for his rifle, levering a single round into the chamber with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the gathering gloom. He laid it across his lap, a silent guardian. It took several attempts, but the sparks finally caught, coaxing a fragile flame from the tinder. The warmth, meager as it was, felt like a miracle. The dancing light softened the harsh angles of his face, revealing a scar that ran from his temple into his hairline. He watched the flames, then looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. "Silas," he said, his voice softer, a bare introduction. "Ilara," she replied, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so long. He offered her a strip of dry jerky. It was tough, tasteless, but nourishment. She tore into it, her hunger a monstrous entity. Silas ate slowly, methodically, his eyes still scanning the darkness beyond the meager firelight. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not empty, but watchful. She felt a nascent sense of something she hadn't known in weeks. Not safety, but shared vigilance. And in that, a quiet, fragile understanding began to take root. The next morning broke with biting clarity. The landscape, glazed with thin frost, stretched vast and indifferent. Silas was in pain, evident in the grim set of his mouth, but lucid, his movements slow but deliberate. He showed Ilara how to pack the wound more tightly, using strips of his own torn shirt, grimacing as she worked. His instructions were clipped, practical. He had seen her tend to him, had seen her fragile resolve, and now he seemed to accept her presence, if not entirely trust it. They moved slowly, carefully, keeping to the shadows of canyons and the folds of the land. Silas, leaning heavily on a gnarled staff, directed their path with uncanny knowledge of the terrain. He seemed to read the land as a familiar map, sensing water where none was visible, finding routes through impassable rockfalls. Ilara, though still weak, felt a new purpose. She was no longer simply surviving for herself. She was part of a desperate, quiet conspiracy of two against the indifferent world and the unseen men who pursued Silas. He shared what little food he had, always ensuring she had enough, even when his own portion dwindled. He taught her how to recognize tracks, how to tell fresh sign from old. She, in turn, found quiet satisfaction in tending the fire, in making the meager meals stretch. There was a rhythm to their shared silence, a language built on glances, small gestures, the rustle of clothing, the soft scrape of their boots on rock. She learned to anticipate his needs, to move without disturbing him. He, in turn, learned to rely on her quiet presence, her steady hand. Days bled into a week. They skirted the edges of isolated settlements, never venturing close. Silas's wound was slowly mending, a testament to his resilience and Alara's careful tending, but the threat remained. His eyes perpetually scanned the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle. The air itself felt thick with unspoken tension, a constant hum beneath the silence. One afternoon, a sudden, chilling urgency gripped Silas. He stopped dead, hand raised, his gaze fixed on a distant plume of dust, faint but unmistakable against the stark blue sky. Horses, several of them. Fast. Down, he rasped, low, urgent. Now. He dragged himself into a shallow depression, pulling Alara down with him, pressing her face into the dry earth. The smell of dust and sage filled her nostrils. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird. She heard faint thud of hooves, growing louder, closer. The men were coming. These were the men he had warned her about. Silas's arm was a steel band across her back, pinning her down. His breath was ragged against her ear, but his body rigid, absolutely still. The hooves pounded, a drumbeat of terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shrink herself to disappear. The sound grew deafening, right above them, then began to fade. They were passing. But would they see them? Her breath hitched. She fought the urge to cry out, to move, to even twitch a muscle. Dust from the horse's passage settled on them, fine and suffocating. A fly buzzed lazily near her ear, an excruciatingly loud drone. The air was thick, heavy, laden with the metallic tang of fear. She heard Silas's slow, deliberate breathing, a counterpoint to her own frantic gasps. He thought they were just resting, waiting for the danger to pass. But then, a faint, almost inaudible whisper escaped her lips, a sound born of an instinct so deep it bypassed thought. "If we breathe soft," she murmured, her voice thin, reedy, barely there, "they get mad." Silas stiffened. His grip on her tightened, a silent acknowledgement. He understood. This wasn't just about hiding from men. It was a primal fear, the kind that extended to the very air, the very act of existing too loudly. It was the fear of being seen, of being known, of drawing any attention to oneself in a world that sought to erase the vulnerable. He lay there, his gaze fixed on nothing, his own breath shallowing, mirroring hers. The hooves faded to nothing, but the echo of Alara's words, and the raw, unadorned fear they carried, hung heavy in the air between them. The world outside their small, dirt-filled hollow felt impossibly vast and cruel. The immediate danger passed, but the tension remained coiled, a tight spring. Silas slowly released his grip on Alara, pushing himself up, his eyes still scanning the horizon. He didn't look at her, but she felt his silent understanding, a profound connection forged in the shared crucible of fear. The pursuit was relentless. These men were not trackers but hunters. They would not give up. For 2 more days they pushed north, towards a mountain pass Silas spoke of in whispers. The cold deepened, the ground becoming treacherous with ice. His wound, though healing, stiffened in the chill. Alara found a new resilience stirring within her, a fierce, protective instinct not just for her own survival, but for this silent, watchful man who had, against all odds, become her anchor. She started carrying his rifle when he struggled, helped him over difficult terrain, her small frame braced against his weight. She found herself scanning the landscape with an intensity she hadn't known she possessed, reading the subtle shifts in Silas's demeanor, anticipating his needs. They were nearing the pass when the horses returned. This time, no dust, no warning. Just the sudden, chilling sound of a rifle shot echoing through the icy air. A ricochet off a rock near Silas's head sent chips of stone flying. They were ambushed. Silas cursed, a low, guttural sound, pulling Alara behind a cluster of boulders. "Stay low," he hissed. 3 riders dismounted, their faces grim, cold. They wore the same practical, worn clothes as Silas, but their eyes held a predatory gleam. They were not lawmen, nor simple bandits. They were something far more dangerous, personal. Silas raised his rifle, taking aim, his movements fluid despite his injury. He fired a single shot, and one of the men crumpled, clutching his leg. Another shot followed, then another, the reports deafening. Alara watched, frozen, as Silas moved with deadly precision, an almost animalistic grace. This was his world, and he was a predator in it. But they were outnumbered. The remaining 2 men were circling, trying to flank them. One, a gaunt man with a cruel smile, appeared on a ridge above them, raising his rifle. Alara saw him, saw Silas's attention elsewhere, heard the click of the hammer. Without thinking, driven by instinct, she grabbed Silas's discarded pack knife. Small but sharp. She lunged forward, not at the man, but at loose rocks beside the path leading up to him. She scrambled, heaved, dislodging a cascade of stones. They tumbled down, creating a sudden roar, startling the man on the ridge, throwing off his aim. His shot went wild, embedding in the rock above Silas. Silas turned, eyes wide with surprise, then a flicker of understanding. He saw the shift in her, the courage that had replaced fear. It was all the opening he needed. He raised his rifle, steady now, and fired twice. Both men fell. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the pass. Alara stood panting, the knife heavy in her hand, her body trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline. She had acted. She had fought. She had contributed to their survival, not merely been a passenger. Silas slowly lowered his rifle. He walked to her, his gaze intense. He reached out, not to comfort, but to take the knife from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. There was no need for words. The knowledge in his eyes, the subtle nod, spoke volumes. She was no longer the desperate, abandoned woman. She was a partner, a survivor, capable and strong. They continued, the silence between them now one of mutual respect, a quiet, unspoken bond stronger than any words. The pass was behind them, the landscape softening as they descended into a valley, hints of green beneath the fading snow. The world still held its dangers, its uncertainties, but Alara no longer faced them alone. She looked at Silas, his silhouette against the pale, setting sun. His quiet strength had pulled her from the abyss, but it was her own, newfound strength that would carry her forward. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, the cold grip of despair had loosened, replaced by a fragile, yet undeniable ember of hope. She had found dignity in the dust, and a quiet, resolute strength that would not be easily extinguished.